I'm with Jamie Ford, a New York Times bestselling author. He's going to appear at the Hamilton East Public Library in downtown Fishers, Saturday, October 1st. So if you're listening or watching this podcast on or before that date, he'll be there at 1 and 4 p.m. A library very much recommends that you get a registration in because there is limited room for each of those, and it is free, but there is a high recommendation that you signed up in advance. So, Jamie Ford, thank you very much for joining me today. It's an honor to have you.
Yeah,
It's good to have you. Good to have you coming to Fishers. It's great to have you in our city as well. You know, you have authored a number of books, and you have a new book coming out that we'll talk about a little later on. But I had the opportunity to read Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. And you know something, excuse me, I'm getting it's fall, so it's getting
sure.
allergies are getting to me. I've over my time working in radio and doing podcasts, I've interviewed a number of book authors off and on, and I always read a book before I interview an author, and I've not enjoyed every book that I've had to read, but I must say it was a great joy to read this Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. I think, really put you on the map as an author. What you did in that book, you clearly meshed together real places and real people to formulate that fictional story. I want to talk more about the story later, but tell me how your life experience informed you in putting that story together.
Yeah, I'm half Chinese on my dad's side. There's an interesting story as to why I have the last name Ford, but suffice to say, I'm half Chinese. And when my dad passed away about 20 years ago, I felt somewhat cut off from my own heritage. And really, just to process my own grief, I began researching the time period of his childhood and my grandfather's childhood. And I wrote a short story that had this young Chinese American boy kind of as a witness of all the things that were happening in Seattle during World War II. And my dad was that age. And in the book, the character of Henry, he's wearing a button that reads "I am Chinese" because after Pearl Harbor, there was confusion as to who was an ally and who was a perceived enemy. And my dad wore one of those buttons, and he talked about walking to school and the white kids throwing rocks at him, calling him a Jap and things like that. But I'm a fairly sentimental guy, and I couldn't help but turn it into a bit of a love story. All my books tend to have they tip the emotional Richter scale pretty hard because I shamelessly lean into it. I love stories, and I think stories of often stories of the heart in conflict with itself for me is more interesting than stories about gun battles and asteroid collisions. Um, but that's a long answer to a very short question.
No, it's a very, very good answer, I must say. And you do something in this book that any author would tell me is a very risky proposition. The whole story is told through the eyes of Henry. You start off the book with 1986 senior citizen Henry, and before you know it, you're back in 1942 with the 12-year-old Henry. You go back and forth. You don't take it chronologically, but I think it works very well. Explain why you chose that writing approach.
Yeah, I began the journey writing just in the 40s, but I wanted to give the book more of a redemptive ending, and I couldn't find that redemptive ending in the 40s for Japanese American families who've been incarcerated, as long as 4 or 5 years, coming out of those camps having lost everything. That wasn't redemption. It was quiet relief at best. And I found by jumping to another timeline, I could look at that time through a different lens. And it just so happened that in Seattle, a very real hotel in what's now the International District, but what used to be Nihonmachi, Japantown, the hotel is called the Panama Hotel. And in the 80s, the hotel changed owners, and the new owner discovered all these belongings in the basement, the belongings of 37 Japanese families they stored their belongings there as they were being taken away to camp. And those belongings are still there to this day. I think 3 families came back to retrieve their belongings, but the rest is still there. And so that became a really, uh, it became a waypoint for the story between, because the hotel really is a silent character with a footprint in each time period. And so I could look at those belongings and also look at the people who put them there all those decades ago.
And you've already touched on this, but I want to hear more about this because you explore something that I think only a small number of Americans truly understand. And it's the enmity felt between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans. Because when you go back to the 40s and as World War II, as America entered World War II, uh, China and Japan had been at war, I think, for about 10 years at that point, Japan invading China. So the Chinese Americans had a low view of Japanese Americans because of that history and what was going on. So I'd like you just to explain a little bit about that part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, there was a conflict. You know, it didn't become personal until Pearl Harbor, and then it became personal in a very large way. But before that, the China and Japan, they were not golfing buddies. There was a lot of enmity between those two countries and those two cultures, and in many ways, that still exists to this day. Um, Not just in those countries, but within those communities, even in our country. I worked and lived in Hawaii for a number of years, and one of my coworkers was Chinese, and she married a Japanese man, and her parents refused to attend the wedding. And this was in the 90s. This wasn't 1942. So some people, they have that emotional baggage and they can't let it go. And I wanted to explore that because in Seattle, you have Chinese and Japanese people living side by side, going to the same schools, and yet they are two completely different rich cultures, and one was at war with the other. And my main characters are young children, and for them to get caught up in that, they become these really interesting point of view characters, because the great thing about young characters is, especially in historical fiction, is I can describe what's going on and they don't quite comprehend the magnitude of it. But the reader, is in the future looking back and feels that tension. And it does, it creates a dramatic tension on the page that is, kind of what propels the novel.
You spend a number of pages of that book giving the reader, I think, a very specific and personal concept of, and you've referred to it already, the horror and the pain felt by Japanese Americans who were sent to internment camps beginning in 1942 during the war. Just as an aside, when I went to college, I started working in the broadcasting business after high school. Then I decided I better go to college, and I was a non-traditional student, but I ended up on the debate team. My debating partner was even more of a non-traditional student. He was 45 years old, a local politician to boot, but he every time we talked in a debate, the debate question had to do with the powers of the presidency. And he always brought up the Japanese internment camps of the 1940s as an abuse of presidential power by Franklin Roosevelt at that time. I mean, even in the 1970s, when I was in college, for him, that was still a memory for him and he was not Japanese American in any way. It just was something that he felt was very unfair. I'd like you to ask you about the kind of research you did, or maybe personal experience that you had in writing about the Japanese internment camps in such a personal way.
Yeah, it doesn't appear on the page in the novel, but the the process that led to the Japanese internment didn't begin with Pearl Harbor. It began around 1919 with the formation of anti-Japanese leagues all over the West Coast. Most of them were supported by one man who owned several newspapers, and he had a financial interest in removing the Japanese, removing the competition, removing cheap labor, removing competition in agriculture communities. So there was this hostility that had been there, that he had been stoking for decades, that led to this. Because most of the people, 120,000 plus people who were sent to camp, most of them were American born. They're American citizens. And so, yeah, it was an overreach, which is why there was, uh, the formal apology in the 80s by Reagan and then signed by President Bush. Um, yeah, it's interesting because my family's been here since the 1800s, and so even though I grew up in a Chinese American household, we're Americans. We don't have I don't have grandparents who died during the Japanese occupation of China and things like that. And so even though I'm Chinese, I see it from a very American perspective. And I can understand the hysteria. We got a little taste of that hysteria post 9/11. I think there was one legislator in Virginia that wanted to create internment camps for Muslim Americans. Fortunately, that did not happen. But fear causes people to lose reason. When people don't have reason, justice can't work because there's nothing to give it traction. And then we fall prey to our worst instincts. And this was fear, but it was fear on top of an unspoken plan to do something about the Japanese in these communities.
Yes, and the one thing that I have learned studying history and talking to people who lived through that era, what so many people became upset about is just what you touched on, and I think comes through very clearly in your book, that these people who are Japanese by heritage and or Oriental by as people could see were just as much Americans as my ancestors who were German and Irish and French and in Welsh. I mean, they didn't consider themselves German or Welsh or French. They considered themselves Americans. And these Japanese people, and I think it's shown to the family that you write about, they consider themselves Americans even in the internment camp, which is just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, imagine being threatened with deportation to a country that you were not born into. That's not deportation, that's banishment. That's a whole other thing. Yeah, when writing about the internment, I tell my kids, and I often visit schools and I talk about this. Lies are bad, but half truths are often more dangerous because people more readily believe them. And some of the half truths around the Japanese internment, the argument for having all of these American citizens incarcerated and losing all of their belongings, was that there were spies and saboteurs and things like that. And like it was said that they found maps of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in the homes of some Japanese Americans. And that sounds scary. Oh, they must be spies or something. They didn't say the other, the other part of the story is those maps were in Life magazine, on the coffee table of 30,000 homes in the Northwest. And so it's when you look at what happens today with politicians of every stripe, they make their hay with half truths, and it's kind of been the blueprint to divide people for as long as as we can remember, unfortunately.
And the way you tell this story is through the eyes of people and their personal relationships. And of course, Henry, Chinese American heritage, befriends Keiko, a Japanese American, at her school. This caused very serious problems with his parents, his father in particular. You also look at Henry's relationship with not only his own father, but his own son. And what I think you end up finding is that whether Henry liked to believe it or not, he became much like his father, and his son became much like him. So family relationships are a very big part of this story. Talk a little bit of how you put that in the story and made that work and told the story in a very special way.
Yeah, that's truly at the core of all my books, because I think there's no drama like drama under the same roof, because it's drama that you can't escape. Henry's father represents an era of Chinese Americans that, they were very involved in the war with Japan. They were raising funds to, and they had relatives fighting and dying So very much invested in that. Where, but at the same time, this generation of people sent their children to school, and they want them to be, become American, to have every advantage of this country, but also try to retain some of their cultural identity. And it's really hard. I visited a lot of ESL classes, English as a second language, that have read this book, and when I was first invited, it was one in Seattle, so I thought most of the students would be Chinese or Japanese, but they were kids from Bahrain, from Pakistan, from Kenya, from Chile, from all over the world. And they all had that same struggle of assimilation. How much culture do you retain? How much of your identity do you hold on to? And that's a battle under one roof between generations. And despite that conflict, the part of the book that takes place in the 80s, where Henry was as a young child, is now a grown man, he does have that moment where he's somewhat horrified to find out that he has in many ways become his father.
One of my favorite parts of this story is when 12-year-old Henry befriends an African American jazz musician. He plays on the street. His name is Sheldon. He's a sax player. He eventually ends up in a band and does very well, but they become friends when he was just playing for tips on the street. You don't see a Chinese American becoming a jazz fan, but Henry does. And that's part of the story. Talk about how Henry becomes a fan of jazz in this book.
Yeah, I think this happened to my own family. My dad loved jazz. My grandfather loved jazz, and I think that's a byproduct of, in many ways, Seattle was a red line city, so there were only certain neighborhoods where people of color could buy a home or rent, and that extended to Jewish Americans and in some cases Italian Americans. So you compressed all of these different cultures into these neighborhoods, and so you did have not just living next door to one another, but going to school with one another. We had very diverse schools for the 40s, and so my dad just grew up with that kind of music. I remember walking through Chinatown in Seattle, and my grandfather pointing to clubs and saying, like, Cab Calloway played there, Ella Fitzgerald played there, and at the time, I'm just a young kid. I was like, yeah, whatever. And then I did the research for this book and found out that on South Jackson, which runs right through the middle of Chinatown, there were 38 jazz clubs. It was, to write the book without jazz would have felt false. I'm leaving out an important part of that neighborhood's history.
And a very rare jazz record is a big part of the story. I don't want to give too much away if you want to read the book, but I love that part of the story. It's great to hear you say that you feel that's as part of Seattle's heritage in a way. When Henry's good friend Keiko's family heads to internment, I mean, that's where that gets emotional when you see what's going on there, because Henry, finds as a young man a very creative set of ways to visit her, sometimes taking great risks to do so. But eventually, Keiko and Henry fall apart through distance, time, and some family meddling, we find out later. But young romance is central to this story. I really love that part of the story. Talk about why that is so much a part of the story you're trying to tell here.
I I like coming of age stories, I think. And for some people, coming of age is 8. For some people, coming of age is 48. We mature at different rates, um, and reinvent ourselves along the way. Um, but there's something very sweet of the coming of age love story. Um, if you make the kids much older than 15 or so, it starts to get more hormonal. It gets a little more complicated, and it loses its innocence. And I I like the innocence part. I do like, I with that book, I tried to echo the decorum of movies in the 40s, where um love was all consuming, not all consummating, and there is a difference. Um, and that tension, that aching, that longing from films like Casablanca, um, it's such an intense love story. You don't need it to be Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie in a devoid of clothing in a very cinematic sex scene. It's just this noble endeavor of love, and to have young characters discovering that. I remember that from when I was a kid at that age, when I was like 12. And, my world is comic books and football and Legos. And then I had a crush on a girl, and like the next week, suddenly I'm just like, oh, love sucks. This is hard. Like suddenly I discovered this whole adult world of emotion, and it can be crushing at times. And everyone has those moments at some point in their lives. And so it's universally relatable. It's something that I wanted to write about. Unfortunately, a lot of people enjoyed reading about it.
I can see why audiences were drawn to this story, kept it on the New York Times bestseller list for a very long time. I wanted to highlight this because that's a book I had a chance to read. You've written several books since then. You have a new one out. Talk about the books you have out, and particularly the one you are talking about right now.
Yeah, my first three books were all historical fiction set in and around Seattle, which is where I'm from. The books are almost, my love letters to old Seattle. They go back a little bit in time. So, Hotel on the Corner of Bittersweet's in the 40s. My second book is Depression era, and then the book before that takes place in the early 1900s. The new book that I have out, which just came out in August, is called The Many Daughters of Afang Moy. I call it my big box of crayons because it's an evolution for me. So it's historical. It's also speculative, has magical realism, takes place all over the world, as well as Seattle. But the title character, Afang Moy, was the first Chinese woman to come to America. She came to this country in 1834, and I gave her fictional descendants all the way into the future. That's a really long description. So what I should say, the short description, which I actually posted this on Twitter like 3 days ago. I just described it as it's about inherited trauma and also a love story. And that description seemed to work because 17,000 people pressed like on that tweet. So some people relate to trauma and love stories and their interconnectivity.
Says something about today that the number of likes is a barometer of where you are as an author. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We live in this weird attention economy where everyone, we're getting these little micro endorphin hits, and they want to be TikTok influencers and all that stuff. And the character of Afang Moy was super famous, but she had zero autonomy over her own life. And that made her a very interesting character to write about.
Well, and your latest book is definitely getting quite a buzz, and I congratulate you on that. I certainly did specifically love Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, but your latest book is definitely the talk of the town now, and many towns around America, and it's good to see that. I mean, you have a style of writing that I just enjoy very much, and I hope you continue this. And my final question for you is: if there's a young writer, aspiring writer watching or listening right now, it's especially the publishing industry has changed so much. What's your advice for the young writer these days?
This is advice someone gave to me, and I did it, and it was cheaper than an MFA, which I do not have. I don't have a master's in creative writing or anything like that. A very successful author said, go to a garage sale, buy 3 of the worst out of print books you could find, and force yourself to read them as an author. Pick them apart, find fault with everything. And then when you sit down to your own work, you'll catch yourself if you happen to make those same kind of mistakes. And it was true. It really worked for me. It cost about 50 cents. And several late nights of reading terrible books, but I do think you can learn from reading bad work as well as reading great work. In fact, the other side of that coin is when someone's trying to figure out how to write, they're trying to write their first novel or short story or memoir. I always encourage people to stop reading their favorite authors because it's like trying to lose weight and only reading Vogue magazine. You're gonna die a death of comparison, and it's very frustrating. And maybe the last piece I'm giving you tons of advice, but the last bit is allow yourself to fail. Give yourself permission to fail. No one sits down at a piano and plays Rachmaninoff right out of the gate. No one sits down at the keyboard and writes the great American novel right out of the gate. you're going to have some bad notes, and understand that's just part of the process. It's part of the craft. It's part of learning. And if you stop when you have, you know, one bit of failure, um, stopping is the failure. The mistake might have made on the page is not the failure.
I've heard many authors say that the advice they give aspiring writers is to read. I think you're the first person that said, right, make sure you read bad fiction.
Yes, yes. It's just very useful, I think. It's a very practical. And also, you know, if you want to have a sustained career, it's helpful to remember you're a storyteller, not a writer. No one really wants 600 pages of writing. They want 600 pages of story. And we often lose sight of that.
I think it was Mark Twain that once wrote that every writer, at least in his case, when he would write anything, he rewrote every paragraph 3 or 4 or 5 times. Do you go through something like that?
Yeah, maybe not 3 or 4 times, but I do. It's that's why, you know, my wife can be like, you've been working on that for 6 hours. What did you get? I'm like, oh, I wrote a page. And some days it's the opposite of that. I've written 20 pages. So it varies, but there is a craft to it. But the craft for me, I think, I I just don't think it should obfuscate the story. I think you need a story first.
You never know when someone's going to watch or listen to a podcast, but Jamie Ford is coming to Fishers. He'll be at the Hamilton East Public Library Saturday, October 1st, 1 p.m., 4 p.m. Highly recommended that you register so you make sure you can get in and see him. All I can say is, Jamie Ford, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to seeing everyone in a few days.